This time on the Learning Hack, we're asking, what is the role of the learning function in the future? And more importantly, perhaps for you people, does it have one? Welcome to the Learning Hack, a podcast about the people and technologies that are creating the future of learning. I'm John Helmer.
Now guess what?
Learning is cool. Learning is cool. Learning is cool. I'm learning.
Learning is fun.
And knowledge is power.
Knowledge. Education.
As a global head of talent, my guest this episode has spent a lot of time at conferences and trade shows talking to people who are trying to sell her learning tech, and finds a worrying disconnect between the industry and people like her that it is selling to. Worryingly, none of them seem to know very much about how people learn. But instead of just bitching about vendors on social media, she decided to make it the subject of her PhD thesis. Kate Fitzgerald, Head of Fact, tell us about her.
Hack Facts.
Serena Gonsalves Fersch is Head of Talent for the SoftwareONE Academy, a learning and development leader, a Fellow of the Learning and Performance Institute, and currently also a doctoral candidate at Middlesex University. She has been researching the future of learning and the L&D function in technology accelerating organisations. The research looks at new, emerging and evolving organisations to establish at what point they should introduce a managed learning function, if indeed they should, and what the role, structure and remit of that function should be.
So, Jay Curtis, Head of Themes. What themes did we cover?
Serena's immediate experience is in the technology sector where she works, so when it comes to tech innovation, she's really at the forefront of new developments. But that allows her to talk more generally about the role of L&D in the future, since a lot of what's currently rocking her boat will shortly be rocking everybody else's. And she's spoken to people in other sectors too, so the work has a wide applicability.
Serena has a real passion for her subject and brings a lot of energy to the debate. I really enjoyed talking to her. But what makes her a standout guest for me is that she's bringing us the preliminary results of her PhD research before her thesis has even been written. This is a box-fresh take on the future of L&D. Serena, welcome to the Learning Hack.
Hi John, thank you for having me here.
You're welcome. First of all, can you tell us about your role at SoftwareONE and about the SoftwareONE Academy?
Absolutely. So I created SoftwareONE Academy about a year and a half ago under the vision of our CEO. The idea was to create a corporate university and an education philanthropy with a difference. So we source, recruit, develop, and then transition grassroots level technical talent from communities all over the world and people who would not necessarily have a chance at a career in technology. So they come from non-traditional education routes like boot camps or charities. And what we do is take them on, we incubate them, and then transition them into SoftwareONE. So it is L&D, but it's also talent acquisition, it's also workforce planning, and it's also, like I keep saying, this bridge, this way to grow your future workforce.
And is that the way to deal with the skills shortages in your industry? Is that the intention?
Absolutely. It's no secret. You look at any report at the moment from Gartner to the World Economic Forum, we have a big dearth of technical talent, and the skills gap keeps increasing between how many are needed and where they are needed to how many we have across the world. What the Academy is a way to look at a whole genre of people that probably didn't have that stepping stone, or people whose careers got completely decimated by the pandemic and have to transition into the world of tech, and look at how we can bridge that gap in a meaningful way. So not learning for the sake of learning, but learning that you can actually deploy and reduce time to competency and billability.
That's really interesting, using L&D as a way of bridging the skills gaps in that industry in that particular way. as well as all that, which I'm sure is an exhausting full-time job, you're also a doctorate researcher studying with a PhD, Middlesex University. Can you tell us about the subject of your doctoral thesis? That's what I want to kind of major on in this interview, if that's okay. And something about what your researchers have turned up so far.
Absolutely. So I'm what they call ABD, all but dissertation, which means I've completed all the research. I just need to find the time to write 65,000 words. So where the research looks at the future of the learning function or the learning profession in technology accelerating hypergrowth and startup firms. So organization structures are fundamentally changing. Organizations are changing. The makeup of them is changing. What is the role of the learning function, if it has one? Because I'm quite prepared to accept it probably doesn't have one in the future. What is the role of that learning professional, and how does it fit with the pace of this of the new organization? That's what the research is about in the nutshell. So I spoke with over around 70 people from absolutely every continent in the world, from CEOs and chief people officers to thought leaders and learners, learning leaders, in the profession. And I've come up with what I hope will become a set of a handbook or a recommendation for our profession going forward.
So apart from helping you to get your PhD, you'll also be releasing this as a resource for the profession, yeah?
It's what I'm hoping to do. The reason I started this was I went for all these conferences, the technology exhibitions, and met so many vendors, and I felt that there was a big disconnect between what I was experiencing as a learning leader and what people were selling to me. There was a huge disconnect between understanding what's efficacy, what's outcome-based learning, what's learning. Half the people I met could not articulate how adults learn in an organization, and they had stuff to sell. Somehow content became synonymous with learning, and all of these frustrated me, and I wanted to see whether there was a difference that I could make, not by becoming, providing yet another service, but having an information source that was free, that was research that was unbiased, that research that was for people like me, other learning leaders, and that's from where the doctorate came about.
So a number of interesting strands within your work. We've had a fairly brief discussion about this thesis before, but even from that brief discussion, a number of things come up to me. So one of these is there is a theme there of how L&D and talent leaders buy, how they select the vendors they want to work with. You've talked about the need for sensitivity, reputation and integrity from vendors in response to a post on social media from Ashley Sinclair, who highlighted two particularly egregious examples of things going badly wrong. What do you think can be said about the reasons why these jarring mistakes occur, and what does that tell us about our industry? For people who haven't read that post, I think there are a couple of very inappropriate marketing communications that came from learning vendors. Do you want to talk about that?
Absolutely. So what triggered this, and unfortunately it just happened to be two in a week, where there was the tragic mass shooting in the US, and a vendor instantly created 5 pieces of e-learning on characteristics of active shooters, and then used the hashtags to do with that event to market their platform on which this e-learning sat. It felt in such poor taste, and there's been a few of that. I've seen vendors suddenly translate packs of e-learning into Ukrainian, and then use LinkedIn as a platform to go, we're going to make this available for people who want to learn. And it just feels that as a vendor, and I'm talking now as a learning leader, as a consumer. I've only ever been on this side of the fence. I've been a management consultant which delivers learning solutions, but this is me as your buyer talking. We buy on the back of conversations that we have with other leaders. We buy on the back of what is absolutely necessary for our firm. The days where you bought 20,000 pieces of content under one license and that made a good learning leader, those are going. Personalization of content, human-centered design, all of these things are becoming relevant. So getting on the bandwagon of tragedy, thinking that you're talking to learning leaders who are magpies after the next shiny object is not going to work. It leaves a poor taste in your mouth. Start talking about the outcomes that your learning gives instead of just telling me how much time my people can spend on it. I think that would be, that it's a very, very strong message, and I believe in this very strongly.
So stop ambulance chasing and just trying to hit the topical issue.
I might steal that word for it is absolutely true. Stop looking at what sounds cool at the moment. Understand the industry that you're catering to. Understand the profession you're catering to. We're looking at how can somebody be better in an organization to deliver business outcomes. If that's what your starting point is, then what is it that a learning leader would need from you in order to make those outcomes possible?
Okay. Without kind of seeking to excuse those inappropriate communications in any way, if we're looking at the reasons why things like this happen, is it possible the contributory factor is that so often in the news headlines, training is used as an instant, almost knee-jerk response to a tragedy or a disaster or things going wrong. So you'll hear of some kind of awful thing that's happened with policing, and the next thing you know, there's a spokesman saying it's all right, we've put training in place, and the government will come up with this as well when there's some new scandal from Number 10. So often it's a knee-jerk response. We're going to do the training, so it'll be all right. So we kind of get into that mode of thinking that training is a kind of palliative for anything that's going wrong. Do you think that's working?
No, I have very strong opinions on this, and often unpopular. I'll give you an example. Unconscious bias training is a great one. There's a lot of things that we hide behind to say, oh, this was an unconscious bias. And a lot of things we hide behind because when it's easier to offer training than fix the actual problem. I've known of firms where they've had bribery or issues at leadership level, and then suddenly you've cascaded anti-money laundering and ethics training across the entire firm, so you can then go to press and say all my employees are now trained on how to behave ethically. So therefore, I don't have the problem at the leadership level where millions went missing. So everything becomes a learning problem if you don't sit to actually address what the problem is before. And unfortunately, as long as learning leaders always respond to a request for a course with, yes, sir, 3 bags full, sir, we're not going to ever help resolve this issue. We're not going to be able to be in a position where you push back, and when somebody says, give me a course, you go back and say, what is the business problem you're trying to solve? And until that question becomes more fundamental to e-learning or face-to-face as a response to being asked, we're constantly going to be in this place where it was L&D's fault that our people have not incorporated behaviors or not done something.
So how can learning leaders change that situation and that orientation when it comes to vendor selection and buying technology products? What's your advice for L&D there?
My biggest advice is that is what I'm not the first to say, and I won't be the last, but I don't think has fully set in at all. is how commercial are you? How much do you understand of what the business wants to achieve? Do you understand the pipeline? Do you understand how your business makes money? How your resourcing translates into, say, utilization and translates into, therefore, delivery, which then translates into being billed? Do you understand the product that your company is selling, and to what extent? And stop saying seat at the table. I hate those words, because if what you offer has never changed, then why should anybody bring you in now? And then when a learning leader has that understanding, how is that translated then as a vendor? Understanding what you're selling. Off the shelf, I have 20,000 courses, buy 100 licenses or buy thousands of licenses, isn't going to work. Walking into me and saying, tell me about your business. So I can understand it as you understand it. And then how can we take that to the next level? What is the outcomes that you're looking to achieve, and how can I support you delivering them?
So it sounds like you're saying that both sides there, the buyers and the vendors, have to have a sense of what it is the business really needs and how together you can partner to meet that need. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. John, we know now, from when I'm dating myself, but 20 years ago, you can learn now to build a rocket ship on YouTube. Well, maybe not, but close enough. Knowledge
well,
is...
you can learn how to edit a podcast, I'll tell you that. Yeah. Perhaps not build a rocket ship, not quite so impressive. But,
well, I think the point I'm trying to make is how much of free resources are available out there, whether they're MOOCs or whether they're... any of the platforms at the moment of opening up their course libraries, universities opening up their course libraries, or even other companies doing a sort of an incubation or an academy or a grad program model. There is so much of learning outside on the marketplace in open platforms. So if people can go, and you also ask the average employee in the firm, if you don't know something, what do you do? They'll first say, I Google it, and then they'll say, I ask the guy next to me. It's rare that the LMS cracks the top 3, right? Maybe not even the top 5. So what is it that the role that you need to play in the organization as a professional going forward? It all ties in. It all is coming back to this, the doctorate. What is that role we should be expected to play if knowledge is free, if content is free, if initiative is free, if going and getting out stuff is free? What is that role left for us to play? And therefore, what sort of a vendor am I looking to help me, to support me through that?
So it's a great question. What's the answer?
I have a few, and that's why I'm not being prescriptive also with the doctorate. So I think organizations going forward look at that. So first is, as a learning professional, you're looking at what that role is, and that role, yes, it's a bit of curation. Yes, it's a bit of finding the right blend. Yes, it is a bit of the development in the traditional sense. But I really believe it is looking at how getting that fundamental understanding of how people need to progress and what a business needs to deliver, and then going backwards from that, not starting with a product, which is usually a library of courses sitting on an LXP managed by an LCMS in the background or whatever, and then going, this is everything I have, here's my Pandora's box, you pick and choose. So that flipping around of the conversation is definitely what I would say is the solution. And then how it looks for your organization will differ.
In the struggle against the forgetting curve that learning people are engaged in every day, there are no magic formulas, but there is science. For well over a century, psychologists have known that the spacing effect unlocks deep learning and helps learners power through to peak performance. And yet who uses it, despite the fact that modern learning systems like LXPs make it almost easy? I've written a white paper with Learning Pool that shows how you can use the spacing effect to beat the forgetting curve. Download it now. The Learning Hack podcast is supported by Learning News, the learning sector's newswire. Rob and his team are good friends of the podcast, and we really value the help and advice we've had from them, and they do a great job. For the very latest news from around the learning sector, for interviews with learning leaders, the latest from learning sector vendors and features on workplace learning, go to learningnews.com. You also have a focus on tech startups and companies in hypergrowth, and more specifically, when and how they get to set up their L&D function. I found this quite interesting because I did some work a while ago on what size does a business have to get in terms of, maybe turnover and headcount before it actually has an L&D person. Typically, what we found is that small to medium-sized enterprises, as they grow, they'll get an HR person who also does all the training. There might be one person. And this is the reason a lot of tech vendors just won't talk to a company that's smaller than 1,000 headcount, because there's no one to talk to. Apart from the fact, the budgets are smaller. They don't necessarily have the money for the upfront kind of investment in learning technology. They might not have an LMS for them to sell for them to put their content on, and so on. So that's kind of the work that I did. I'm interested in what have you found about the part L&D plays in such a situation.
So my research has shown all three scenarios, and I'll just talk to you about them. So there have been scenarios where they were so focused on development that they brought in an HR administrator to take care of contracts and grievances, that sort of element of tactical HR, and brought in straight a head of talent who looked after learning and talent acquisition. Okay. That model has varying degrees of success, because they reached a point when then they had to grow rapidly, and then the policies that you have, HR is not just something that's tactical. There's the strategic element fell through the gaps. So there was that. I've seen that in a couple of organizations. I saw the one where, exactly as you described, you have HR continue with it for as long as possible, and when you get to a certain size, a couple of hundred to 1,000 is where I've been, and you bring in a learning person, and then what it is you expect. So I've seen them bring from learning coordinators, where often people from the business don't have any experience in L&D. Can you ensure that these guys get their certifications, in whatever, Microsoft or AWS or SAP, etc. And then their role becomes that churn, and then they move probably a bit more strategic once that HR lead has become a chief people officer. You're right, over 1,000. Now, I've also seen the odd organization where the learning person is purely the budget holder of little to nothing. So they followed a marketplace element. Every single person in the organization, like you said, it works for smaller ones, gets an annual budget, say 500 euros or something, and they're responsible for their own development, and the learning person curates that marketplace from where they use their budget to go and purchase that course or that certification, and in internal barter forms of, I'm not going to use all my 500, can I have about 200 of yours? I've got a lot of free stuff, and the learning person's job is to both coordinate that budget and coordinate that mix. Again, varying degrees of success. I do believe that learning can no longer be pulled out from the conversation, where it can no longer be something that you're just talking about content, and you're just talking about buying and courses, buying and the making of courses. I do believe that learning forms part of your talent agenda. So it is from your workforce planning. It's the build versus buy conversation. Should I be hiring this skill or moving people up through strategic L&D and proper career pathing and succession planning? I think it gets incorporated in performance management, and I know a lot of L&D people talk about performance consulting, but but if you ask them how many people have seen the development plans that people write in their performance appraisals, the number goes down to very, very small. So it's part of that enhanced performance discussion. It's part of the how does individual performance translate into an organizational uplift of performance. All of this stuff is going to become more and more part of an L&D professional's every day than what was, which was essentially the purchase, the creation, the maintenance of content and platform.
I'm interested in what you said there about, just to kind of step back about 5 minutes or so, about organisations where everybody has a learning budget, they have the money, and the L&D's person has no budget, but is just there to kind of curate and advise. Now, because that's a new model, that's something that didn't exist in the old world at all. Are there particular types of companies that use that model, and what are the pros and cons of that situation?
So the companies which I spoke with, which had the model, it was a 50-50%. There was a 50% successful, and that was largely down to the tenacity of the learning manager or leader. You know, they kept compliance is always kept, and it all, like it or not, it winds up being actual training. Leadership was the marketplace was opened only to the leadership learning that was signed off by management. So only those courses and levels. There was some degree of siloing of what was made available, but it was the openness of the learning leader to constantly be on top of that curation and purchase technique, to evaluate at the end of the year what made sense. So if 50 people have gone off separately and got a license to Linux Academy, perhaps we can have a conversation about enterprise licenses, to just give you an example, and then take that in and go, okay, now this is the way you purchase going forward. The flip side of it, which was the other organizations I spoke with, or actually it was across the board, is the cottage industries that set up, the efficiency you lose, the time frames that is important. As you start growing, when you get to that magic 1,000 mark, how do you ensure that what you call a software developer in GCP in Brazil has the exact skills of a software developer in GCP, say in India? And that became the parts. And then it has a ripple effect, because if you can't have a global leveling of people, then that affects your career pathing and your succession planning and your deployment when projects get global. So there is it does work, but there are flip sides to it, and it all comes down to how tightly the learning leader and the remit of that learning leader to manage these things tightly with their relationships with the regional or functional stakeholders. So it comes back to that again, irrespective of the model.
Is what you're saying that it works when you're small? When you get larger, that's where you have problems with it. So it seems to be saying that as you grow as a fast-growing company, you need to change your learning culture, just as startups generally have to make some adjustments to their culture as they get bigger, don't they?
Absolutely. And one of the biggest observations is that there's less of organic growth in the tech industry, right? At some point you acquire or get acquired, you merge, you diversify, and when that happens, then you're merging cultures, or you're becoming part of a new organizational culture anyway, and then it becomes harder to maintain something like this. I think it's what you view as an outcome for yourself. If the idea of a learning culture is to get better business outcomes through enhanced individual performance, then what is the method that best suits your firm in order to do that? And maybe it's this, but after a point of time, it's probably not.
So perhaps it's not so much you change your whole learning culture as just the ways and means to fulfill that cultural end.
Yes, changes. And it is also another place where we tend to falter a little, right? Let's buy the platform and then figure out the strategy later, or let's buy the content library and then figure out how we're going to curated. Let's look at how we're measuring its efficiency based on its utilization rather than on what it's achieved. It's I keep coming back to it. It's just flipping down around what we've been doing always to recognize what should come first.
So how much of what you're finding do you think is really specific to the tech industry? I mean, that picture you paint there of, companies don't necessarily grow organically. It might still be just kind of like 5 people in a room for quite a while, and you might get to about 25 and you start to turn over billions. I mean, this has happened with some companies, hasn't it? Like kind of Instagram and so on. And then you get swallowed up by the big behemoth, and suddenly you have kind of all sorts of changes around the way that big organization works, as you say, harmonizing across different territories, and operating at that kind of strategic scale. Now, that's something we recognize with tech. How applicable is that really to the rest of business and organizational life, do you think?
I asked myself the same question, John, which is why I incorporated a couple of firms and their leaders in my interviews who were going through big digital transformations. And I said, if what you are doing with technology is fundamentally going to change your operating model, then as far as I'm concerned, you're a hypergrowth. And in many ways, at least from an organization development point of view, you're a startup. So I spoke to a couple of energy, oil and gas companies, tobacco companies, and what I realized is that the issues exist even there. As soon as technology touches the widest amount of population, there is going to be a change, or it brings about a change in how you operate. It's just that, again, if you, as a learning person, fail to see technology as the enabler to what you're doing, but see it constantly as a solution to fix a problem, it makes no difference on the size of your company. You're going to wind up with these questions coming back at you again and again. And it was something that they had as well. It was, so bigger company, bigger enterprise platforms, but fundamental business outcome and individual performance-based questions, it doesn't matter on the size of your firm. You still have to address the same thing.
So that's interesting, because those industries you mentioned, tobacco, oil and gas and so on, one doesn't necessarily tend to think of those as being in a fast growth area, more in terms of managed decline. I'd have thought. But so what you're saying is it's not specific necessarily to the tech, to the sector, the business sector, and the tech in terms of the tech sector. It's to do with the influence of digital transformation on your industry.
Absolutely, and everyone is, so the ones you're thinking about of managed decline. So tobacco companies are now no longer selling cigarettes, or they're coming up with alternative ways to keep the habit, but they have a better impact on your health. Oil and gas companies, like we call them oil and gas, let's say energy companies, are talking renewables. You have an oil company trying to get you to use less oil. So and all of this, a way for that messaging and the way for that operating model to change is embedded in technology, and the whole organization follows in effectively what is a digital transformation. So if your whole workforce of decades, if not centuries, needs to fundamentally change the way they operate and the way they think, what role does learning play to bring about that change in culture, to support that change in culture? And it can't be, let's throw another course on the platform.
Yeah. Can you give us an example from the people you've talked to of somebody who is in that position, in one of those fast-growing companies going through digital transformation very quickly, and how L&D has to respond in that situation, or how they did?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it's varied. it's everybody's still in the midst of it, and what they've wound up doing is nobody's completed a digital transformation. Let's put it that way. I don't think anybody ever completes really a digital transformation.
Yeah.
So you have, what do I need to do to address the immediate change? And there is a lot of change management and learning based on behavioral change that needs to come out. Marketing plays a huge role. You mentioned Ashley Sinclair before. We don't realize the importance of marketing in learning. We truly don't. You know, learning people are like, if I built a course and nobody took it, did I really build a course? Like if a tree falls in the forest. So a lot of communications, coordinating with marketing, coordinating with learning, coordinating with what the new behaviors that the organization wants seen to exhibit with culture. When people have addressed that as the fundamental of their learning strategy, then the technical bits of what they need to train people on becomes easier. And so this is less from the companies I spoke to, but my own experience, right? As a management consultant, I've done SAP learning implementations way back in the day, and it was always simpler when you're putting in place huge enterprise systems which are going to change fundamentally how people work, how they procure, how they account for things in a unified way. The first thing you deal with is how somebody accepts the change. I really believe that change management, communication, and marketing if that's your basis, then what learning you have to provide is easier to build up on.
That's interesting, because I remember a consultant years and years ago saying to me, all learning is about change, so every learning is a change. So that's where we should start. And what you seem to be saying in learning in these types of situations of digital transformation, change management is a huge component of that, if not the important driver for how you operate.
Absolutely. If every learning done by us as human beings, and the learning profession itself is social constructivist, for want of a better word. Every bit of learning we do from when we're born to where we are now, whether we do it in an organization or whether we do it for self-improvement, to an instrument or to or a dance, it brings about change. And if you are creating something that doesn't directly contribute to performance change, behavioral change, or culture change, or business outcome change, then why are you doing it?
So it's a bit more general than just in particular industries. You feel that change is absolutely the root of what L&D should be doing. And
to quote people wiser than me, the only thing constant is that change. So it's how going back to how the doctorate came about, it was our profession changing as fast as the industries it serviced.
So what advice would you have then for fast-growing companies that are initiating or building the use of learning as enabling and supporting that growth?
The days of the rhetoric of people being our biggest asset is going. The days of having development so it looks good on the annual report are going. The competition for talent out there is vast. It has led to the skills gap we are in now, terms like the Great Resignation and all of this. So look at people and how they learn and why you need them to learn as fundamental to your growth strategy, because ultimately it's these people that will take you there. So it's more than just learning being part of your policy. The well-being, which learning is part of, the progression of which learning is part of, the plan for them as your workforce, so both the roles, the work that you have is interesting and that they can learn from, is just as important as anything that you will do to expand your business. And I think that's the biggest advice I'd give. So given that, think about when you bring in learning, because when is it that the funding that you've got is spent on actually developing people. That's another observation, right? A lot of the funding goes in the infrastructure and the setup and the mass hiring and lots of parties. At what point are you looking at how these people fundamentally contribute to your business outcomes? And then you bring in the learning.
Been a very interesting discussion. We could go on further, but we have to keep the podcast to a reasonable length because people only spend so long walking their dog or doing the ironing or whatever time. So maybe we'll talk again in future. But just to round it off, Serena, do you think you can give us some idea? I know this is a terrible thing to say, when you're going to finish your thesis, because I know these things can take years. But where should people look out for that turning up in the future, and how can people follow your thought?
I'm really active on LinkedIn. I speak at a few conferences. I'm very happy to share there have been about 6 to 8 themes that have emerged under which I have given guidelines. Learning analytics and measurement is one. I've already written about that. Brandon Carson's latest book, I've got a chapter on learning analytics and measurement. I've got on leadership. There is on when and how to set up a learning function. There are about 8 themes in learning. Marketing for learning is one of them. Come and talk to me. Reach out on LinkedIn, and I'll always put in when I'm speaking, like I would for this. I'm very honored to be part of this, John. I have followed you for years, so it's you'll find me.
Thanks, and we'll put some links in show notes. And we're very honoured to have had you today, Serena. Thanks for a really interesting conversation.
Thank you. Thanks, John.
That's all on the Learning Hack podcast for this time, and also the last official episode in the current season. Many thanks to Serena and to our sponsors Learning Pool. The Learning Hack is completely independent and transparently funded by sponsorship. If you want to help others find us, please like, follow, rate, review and subscribe on your podcast platform of choice or on YouTube.
That's all for Season 6, but we've more in store for you in the shape of a podcast swap with one of our favourite learning podcasts, The Death of E-Learning. Look out for that and other bonus episodes. The next full season of Learning Hack and Season 3 of Great Minds on Learning will both commence in September. Till then,
stay curious, learning people.
Now I finally get it.